So let's saddle up some disturbingly clawed steeds and get ready to charge into battle. Let's talk about how the new Death Riders fare with their rules on the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Guard once more. In this video we're taking a look at the Death Riders of Krieg and how they stack up in game. Let's talk briefly about their lore and models, go through their datasheet bit by bit, any obvious synergies from the rest of the Codex units and the detachments, and how they stack up against the competition, most notably those Rough Riders. Lots to talk through, so let's jump straight in. In the background, these guys are basically the cavalry formations of the Death Corps of Krieg, the steeds having quite a lot of similarities with the soldiers themselves, basically more manufactured as opposed to reared and grown in the normal way for horses, and these guys certainly aren't horses, as is kind of obvious by their disturbing clawed feet, or very adept at traversing the battlefield, and bred for aggression to be able to lash out at the enemy that get close, and certainly more dangerous than normal steeds at close range. The steeds themselves are also prepared for hostile environments, wearing the same respirator masks that obscure their faces in the same way as the rest of the Kriegsmen, and basically act as fast attack outriders for the regiment, skirmishing with their equivalent for the foe, and cutting down the enemy infantry in cavalry charges when needed. These guys have recently had some nice new shiny plastic models, initially just released in the Death Corps Army Set box, and they were very much the focal feature there, 10 of them alongside their commander Lord Marshal Dreir, and they should be on sale individually in the not too distant future as well. Likely at around £40, $62 or €51. I strongly suspect that they'll be the same as the Rough Riders per a squad of 5 of them. Generally, the miniatures themselves were pretty well received, from plastic updates to the fairly popular but hideously expensive Forge World models that they replaced. I feel like there's been a fair number of people who will be tempted to start a Death Corps Krieg army, but were put off by the prices of Forge World resin. In any case, the new models are armed with a mix of frag lances, cavalry sabres and las carbines, though it seems that the choice on individual models isn't the biggest deal for this one, as they just count as being equipped with a mix of all of them. I've got a fun fair variety of poses as well, some of them rearing up and lashing out with those clawed talons, some moving from point to point and some charging down the enemy. It means that the Guard have 2 different cavalry units now, the Attilan Rough Riders and the Death Riders of Krieg, both perhaps with a fairly slightly surprisingly similar loadout and role within the Codex, so I feel like they're often going to be compared a fair bit. Models aside though, and let's talk through their datasheet. The Death Riders of Krieg come in a squad of 5 of them for 70 points or 10 of them for 140, those points coming from the shared ones from their upcoming digital update that should drop when the Death Corps box set starts to hit shelves. That's the same price as they were in their Forge World Index, a little bit more expensive than the 60 points or 120 that they were printed in Codex. As you'd expect, they have the mounted keyword, which means they're going to need to move around the edges of ruin and terrain and things, and they have a movement characteristic of 10, which is a little bit slower than the Attilan Rough Riders, and maybe not the most helpful thing in the world for a cavalry-style unit that wants to be getting to grips with the enemy. They might be a little bit dependent on move to make longer charges if they're going to have to skirt around terrain. Otherwise, they've got OC1 and Leadership 7+, and for other keywords they have the Regiment 1, which is useful for a few synergies, plus they have grenades if they want to throw a bunch of mortal wounds at the enemy while they charge in. For their durability, they have Toughness 4 with a 4+ save and 2 wounds. For 14 points, it's not exactly the worst toughness stat in the world, but it also isn't exactly great. It's perhaps in the awkward spots where just about anything that the enemy attacks them with at shooting or melee will be at least fairly effective at destroying them. Anti-tank firepower and small arms maybe aren't ideal here, but they're still going to take a good chunk out of the unit, though they will absolutely get rinsed by things like heavy bolters, which they're pretty much the ideal target for. If the opponent's got a fair few equivalents of those, then it won't take much effort to cut down a unit. I feel like the 10-inch move does give them the chance they might well be exposed to a bit of shooting before they manage to get into the next terrain though I guess maybe you could mitigate that with move and an advance move. Maybe that could be just enough to jump from one piece of terrain to the other. For their damage profile, they all get las carbines. These aren't quite as vicious as the Gaunt Ghost ones, but can still chip in a little bit of small arms fire as they close in. It's 18 inches with 2 shots hitting on a 4+, at the normal las gun, strength 3, AP 0, damage 1, and they have the assault keyword so they can still advance and fire. In reality, these are never really going to be the main plan to do too much with, but given that they're a unit that's likely to be playing at least fairly aggressively, there might be at least some chance they could get some interesting lines of sight and take some pot shots to try and thin down an enemy infantry unit. Anything toughness 3 with lowish saves is going to be their choice of target really. Their main threat's most certainly their melee damage though, and the rider basically has the option of attacking with the Death Rider Frag Hunting Lance or the Power Saber. The Hunting Lance gives you d6 attacks, hitting on a 3+ at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. They're with the lance profile, so they get a +1 to wound on the charge, and the power saber gives you 3 attacks, hitting on a 3 at strength 4 AP 2 damage 1, so basically power weapons there. Then on top of that you get the savage claws from the steed, 2 attacks hitting on a 4 at strength 4 AP -1 damage 1, so basically each rider will have 5 attacks in total that are all hitting at strength 4 and damage 1. Even with other buffs, that is going to limit them to being better against light infantry versus just about anything else. For choosing to fight with the cavalry saber versus the frag lance on the charge, the numbers are actually fairly well balanced against a whole bunch of different targets, and a lot of the time it might not be the most intuitive which one's actually best to fight with. The cavalry saber is almost always best to use if you're not charging though. In that case, the only ones that the frag lance is going to be better against is things that only have invulnerable saves like demons, but if you are charging then things become kind of close against a few targets, but depending a bit on toughness and the armor save of the target. Against these profiles here, the frag lance is better against the termagant and a little bit better against the orc boy, whereas the power saber is better against the battle sister, the intercessor and the terminator profile. And then they're both kind of even against the gladiator tank with a 3+ save. The frag lance wins out very slightly there due to the +1 to wounds. In terms of value out of them though, in general they're going to be at least alright against Space Marine targets or weaker. I feel like they really do more excel against 1 wound infantry compared with the Space Marines, and particularly things like say Battle Sisters, due to having a whole bunch of damage 1 attacks with at least some AP. Given their rivals in the cavalry arena though, it does kind of beg the question as to how well they stack up against Rough Riders, and this is just comparing squad for squad, not even accounting for the fact that Rough Riders are a little bit cheaper. Due to the bit of AP on their steeds' hooves, the Death Riders outcompete against the Termagants and the Orc Boys, and due to the Cavalry Sabres, they're a lot better against the Battle Sister targets due to having lots of AP2 damage 1 attacks. Against the majority of things with multi-wounds though, and having some sort of good armor save, the Rough Riders do generally tend to win out. The Melter Lancers make them fairly solidly better against standard intercessors, a fair bit better against Terminators, and significantly better against vehicles by a crazy amount. A unit of 5 of them does around about 6 wounds to a gladiator tank without any further buffs, whereas the Death Riders are only doing around about 2-ish. As mentioned, the numbers would be even more skewed if I waited for points, given that the Rough Riders are supposed to be 60 points rather than the Death Riders 70, and for sheer damage output that's only going to put them even further ahead. Finally though, for their datasheet, and the Death Rider squadron has the screen line special rule. This one's a reactive move one, so basically when the enemy moves within 9 inches of them, they can immediately make a normal move of up to 6 inches, provided they're not in engagement range. I feel like people are generally fairly used to how these work in 40k now. Lots of good utility that you can get with those. It means that if you were trying to be charged by an enemy melee unit, then they can just move directly back and make that charge longer. If they were about to be shot by a bunch of things, they could maybe try and hide behind terrain if there's some available. Or perhaps other more situational things like moving on to an objective to pile more OC there if you think they're going to survive. Or even potentially moving the other way and moving up to block enemy charges if you think that they were about to charge something that isn't the Death Riders. In general it is a nice rule to have, and occasionally it is going to be the difference between them living or dying. Overall, rounding up those strengths and weaknesses, they are somewhat fast and can be faster with move. They've got good damage against 1 wound infantry, and Guard don't really have a ton of melee units to offer, and these guys are one of them. Their nice reactive remove special rule can wrong foot the foe if they get too close, and for detachment synergies they're going to have the most fun in the recon element, which gives them a few interesting things. For downsides, as mentioned, the mounted keyword means they'll have to move around terrain, which can reduce their charge distances due to having to move a long way. Infantry like Bulgrin could get a big advantage there if they were hiding behind ruins and could just walk straight through. Their defense profile, as mentioned, isn't really great and really wants to hide, particularly if the enemy's got a few heavy bolters about. Their damage output really doesn't compare well to the Rough Riders, I think, which are also cheaper at 60 points. I feel like between that it does leave them rather dependent on getting great value out of that special rule if you're going to take them over the Rough Riders. They do have one other option compared with Rough Riders 2 though, which is to be led by Lord Marshal Dreir, the new Krieg character from the Death Corps box set, who's famed for surviving all manner of situations that he really shouldn't have, despite relentlessly doing his duty and commanding his Krieg forces right from the front, with little regard to his own safety. He was printed at 80 points in the book, though supposedly he's going to be 100 points in Games Workshop's first digital download, has at least an okay defensive stat line with a 4+ invulnerable save, a 6+ feel no pain and 6 wounds, and chips in some attacks with the Sabre of Sacrifice, an anti-infantry weapon 4+, though still only damage 1. For what he brings to the unit, he can give them orders and has 2 more to spare for other regiment units nearby. That can be the source of move or +1 weapon skill, I guess. He's got a gets up on death special rule called Tough to Kill, where if he's slain then on a 2+ he'll get up again, but that only takes effect once the squad's dead usually, so not the best leadership buff in the world I suppose. But more helpfully for the Death Riders, he does have leading the charge, which gives them more devastating wounds on the turn that they charge in. That's pretty nice given the massive amount of volume attacks that the Death Riders get. It does mean that you're going to get a big chunk of mortal wounds against anything. Just to see what that kind of unit is capable of, this is a rough damage output for 240 points worth of Krieg models, 100 points for Marshal Dreir, and 140 for 10 Death Riders. They'll even be able to use the +1 weapon skill order, though sometimes it might make more sense to go for the +3-inch movement, just to make sure that charge actually happens in the first place. For their damage output, most things that are Toughness 3 hordes or standard Space Marine profiles should get wiped out. 4 of them can get into fight, which might not necessarily be guarantees. You do around about 18 wounds to intercessors or 27 slain termagants. And then it gets tougher stuff than that with high toughness values and good saves. It does get a bit more limited. It's around about 11 wounds against Space Marine Terminators, 10 wounds to a Gladiator tank, or 9 wounds to a Land Raider. The vast majority of all of those being from the mortal wounds that they get. Overall, they're going to have a good chance of slaying the unit that they charge in against for most normal sized targets, though it seems unlikely that they'd make 240 points worth of damage back against virtually anything that they charged. For damage output for a big scary unit, it's still probably worth comparing to those Rough Riders too, and if you just compare them side by side to a unit of 10 Attilan Rough Riders, the numbers are a little bit worse for the Rough Riders against the Horde units and the sort of Space Marine style stats, though they're not really all that far behind the big Dreir buff squad. Though the Rough Riders do better against things like the Gladiator tank and Land Raider. Again, all of this is assuming that you have one order coming from elsewhere. The issue is though that the Rough Riders can all do that while only costing 120 points versus the Krieg Death Rider squad with Dreir costing 240, which if that does wind up being their final points cost, just seems kind of horrifically badly balanced. The Rough Riders just really aren't all that worse against the infantry style targets and are massively better against the tanks. I know the Death Rider squad will be more survivable, particularly Dreir himself being able to stand back up. But it does seem that adding Marshal Dreir to the mix really isn't going to move the needle against the damage output comparison with the Rough Riders. At 100 points I think he's just far too costly for what he'd do. Otherwise, beyond Dreir, there's a few other things that can help them out. As mentioned, orders are always big for the Guard. We mentioned the move, and +1 weapon skill, which are both obvious enough. Probably the normal choice is going to be between them. But otherwise, the +1 to saves really isn't too bad for 4+ save models with 2 wounds. That makes them at least somewhat sturdy with a sort of Space Marine style stat line, I guess. And that's really not a bad option if they don't desperately need one of the top 2. Otherwise, they could be a reasonable target for the +1 objective control one, giving you a 10 OC squad to move in and flip an objective could be nice, and then they could maybe beetle away with a reactive move when the enemy tries to take it back. If they are getting orders, then potentially a company command squad with a Master Vox seems a pretty reasonable choice. They seem like the unit that's likely to be operating a bit further away from the main battle line and skirmishing with the enemy, so having orders fly in at 24-inch range seems quite nice. For stratagems, they could use the grenade one if they need to have a bit more punch against some tough targets, which as we can see they struggle with a bit. And otherwise a command point reroll on a key charge is probably going to be the biggest thing, and is often one of the best returns of investment in Warhammer 40k if you fail a short charge. They can also be joined by Lord Solar Leontus as well, if you really wanted the character to lead them. Outside of fun factor though, it's not really a great idea. He's massively expensive and wants to be kept safe to generate command points and broadcast orders all game long. So going with the skirmish cavalry lightly on the front lines probably isn't the best thing to do. Finally, for buffs and synergies, the majority of the detachment buffs often apply to infantry units or revolve around transports or shooting things, and it means for the majority of the good stuff that can actually help them, it'll be in the recon element detachment, where cavalry do get a few things to help them out. They'll always get cover, which is nice for the enemy shooting them down, and then ideally if they can have at least some of the squad tow into cover, then they'll get to improve their base save as well. If they can get cover, then they'd have a passive save of 3+ for things like heavy bolters, as opposed to a squad that's in the open in another detachment only saving on a 5, and that's a pretty big difference against the thing that kills them the best. It could be an okay choice for that courageous diversion rule as well. That gives the unit a 6+ feel no pain, and a -1 to hits that also applies if the opponent tries to shoot anything other than the closest target. If they are ranging out the front, then that seems absolutely fine to make them have to deal with them before they shoot other things effectively. And besides that, there's one for a return to reserves within 10 inches of a board edge. Might be nice for a late game flanking manoeuvre if they survive. And there is one for a -2 inches to charge as well from the Tanglefoot grenade, and that could make them really quite difficult to actually charge into, as they could move 6 inches away in the movement phase and then debuff the enemy charging by another 2. In theory, even if they moved right up to just outside of 1 inches of them, they might still need to make an 8-inch charge or so. Otherwise, beyond that, there's really not all that much. The Siege Regiment, I guess, could make use of the stealth buff when exposed, but not really any more so than any other guard unit. And the Combined Regiment can offer some lethal hits las carbines, plus a few options for out-of-phase orders or extra orders, though again nothing that really seems to help them out any more than any other units. Overall, as you can probably tell, at 70 points I feel like Games Workshop haven't really done them many favours in the rules department. I feel like to be considered a strong unit for the Guard, they'd either need a rules boost or a points drop. Their main weaknesses are they're not particularly tough, not really particularly dangerous besides against light infantry, which Guard don't generally tend to have the biggest problems with dealing with in the first place. They're really somewhat fast, but not quite so much as the Rough Riders, who also unhelpfully outcompete them by out-damaging them. At 70 points they aren't even super expendable compared with other Guard stuff as well. A similar sort of price to a bunch of infantry squad units and lighter vehicles. I feel like all in all their main selling point is their reactive move rule, which is genuinely interesting enough, though I feel like it'd be so much more interesting if they also had the scout keywords to move into the mid-board and give them a bit more chance of messing around on the midfield objectives nice and early. Maybe in a similar sort of role to the Admech Cerberus Raiders if these guys are going to be the Outriders and Rough Riders are going to be the damage dealers. Either way I feel like they could do with something to help them out. As a result, I feel like if you wanted to put them on the table and have them actually have a good impact, I really wouldn't feel too bad about running them with the Rough Rider rules if you've just picked up the Death Corps box set. They basically have almost the exact same gear model to the point where no one's really going to care, and provided you're not doing confusing mixes and matches of different units, there shouldn't really be any confusion. Rough Riders are generally quite good, and actually have the damage to be a really threatening countercharge unit as we saw earlier. If anything, I'm just surprised that the Death Riders aren't going to be the cheaper of the two. Honestly, with these rules, I'd be a bit more tempted somewhere around the sort of 55 point kind of mark as opposed to 70. Rough Riders feel fairly well balanced at 60, I'd say. Obviously though, besides that plan to get them on the tabletop, most people are still likely going to want to run them with their actual rules even if they're not super optimal. And if so, for putting cavalry heavy forces on the tabletop, it does seem like Recon Element is probably the best detachment, making them quite a lot more durable and maybe harder to engage in melee. I think I'd be more tempted to field them in small interference squads with their reactive moves and annoyance skirmishing on the mid-board objectives, ideally trying to stay hidden and then use a combination of move and advancing to jump up to a mid-board terrain piece if they can't get a charge on anything, and maybe towing onto an objective and thinking about using that reactive move to help them stay safe after. If the enemy's got some fairly valuable lighter infantry units, they're going to be absolutely prime targets if they can manage to get the jump on them, ideally charging in, cutting them down, and hopefully winding up out of combat in a place next to some terrain where their reactive move could make it hard to catch up with them. With the rules as they are though, if they do wind up at 70 points, I wouldn't be too surprised if they get some sort of buff in the future. I feel like new shiny things perhaps do have a slightly outsized chance of Games Workshop taking attention with them, not necessarily at the very next balanced data slate, but potentially in ones after that. I'm sure they don't want lackluster rules being a reason that people don't want to pick up some shiny new clawed horses. It sounds like the first points for the Death Riders of Krieg are going live within the next 2 weeks before the launch boxes get shipped out to people. From what's been reported by the other content creators with those points costs, the Death Riders are apparently going to be 70 in that. But I guess those interim points costs might have a new update when the actual Guard Codex goes live on individual sale. That could be one chance to adjust things, and even then the balance update wouldn't be too far away, they're every 3 months anyway. I feel like there's at least some good chance that Games Workshop help them out in some way. In any case though, let me know your thoughts as to the Death Riders of Krieg. How would you rate them as a unit versus the other Imperial Guard squads? Are there any good uses for them that I've missed? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. There'll certainly be a fair bit more for the Guard. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.